The fight for honest history is now a guerrilla war. If you care about public history or history in public, these are two different things. You need to understand what just happened to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the NEH, and what it means for the future of who gets to tell America's story, even what that story is. This is not about a funding shift. It's not a policy adjustment. This is a hostile takeover of public history. The battlefield has changed. The war for honest history is now a guerrilla war. Hey, I'm Tad Sturmer. I teach public history at Johns Hopkins University, and I used to work with the NEH on reviewing film and digital media projects for funding. I say used to because that era is over, and I've reviewed all of the relevant documents and talked to all of my contacts so that you know what's going on. But first, let's go ahead and talk about the NEH before the takeover, what it was, what it did. For decades, the NEH, along with the IMLS, but for the most part the NEH, was the most important federal institution supporting public history. The IMLS was important, but the NEH was the star of the show. It funded from major features to small independent projects tackling untold or underrepresented stories. Always check to see this program is funded in part by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. NEH supported history-focused media at every stage: digital media, filmmaking, development, scripting, filming, post-production, podcasts, websites, the whole gamut. Also, archives. NEH grants digitized and protected irreplaceable records from civil rights movement documents to Indigenous oral histories, and then making them available to the public. It funded major museum installations, heritage site programs, on-site programs, in-your-face programs, and public engagement projects that encouraged a complex, nuanced understanding of history, and ones that engaged, ones that fostered discussion. But it also provided scholar and practitioner collaboration. Funding was determined by peer-reviewed panels, in my cases, for film and digital media projects. So what we did, there were 3 academic historians, 3 filmmakers. I've been on both sides of that process. And I can tell you there was no ideology involved. That for the most part, projects were chosen based upon 2 simple questions. Does this project help us know more than we know now? Does it help us understand what we already know better? The NEH wasn't perfect, but it was the major federal institution funding rigorous, honest history at scale. That's now over. Now let's talk about what is prohibited. It's a long list with the new executive orders, and they are still new, by the way. They're only 2 weeks old. Imagine. Either way, based upon exactly all of the language drawn from that, and drawn from Project 2025, and drawn from the 1776 Commission. This is all the stuff that's involved with this. The NEH has been purged of any history that does not conform to an explicitly nationalist framework. If your public history project does any of the following, you can forget about NEH funding. If your project acknowledges systemic oppression, any project that explores, quote, racial disparities, gender discrimination, class struggle, or structural inequality is now framed as indoctrination. If your program discusses the United States as, historically racist or discriminatory, not the U.S., you can still talk about enslavement, you can still talk about indigenous removal or segregation, but only if you frame them as individual moral failings or weaknesses or complications of character, but not as systemic realities with lasting consequences. If your project examines race and identity in structural terms, the NEH now bans anything that treats people as part of a group rather than as isolated individuals, which means no discussion of white privilege, unconscious bias, or racial hierarchies. If your project has the gall to critique colorblind ideology, funding is denied now to any project that challenges the idea that, quote, merit, excellence, hard work, fairness, neutrality, objectivity, and racial colorblindness are universal apolitical values. Meritocracy, folks. And if your project makes anyone feel bad about history, forget about it. Well, more to the point, if your project makes white people feel bad about history, forget about it. You can make non-white people feel as bad as they want, because they're not the people in charge now. NEH policy now borrows directly, now applies directly, anti-critical race theory directives, banning projects that could lead a white person to feel, quote, guilt, anguish, or distress about the past. That means no engagement with honest history's consequences. So, projects that are now defunded, got a documentary on redlining? No. You have a museum exhibit on labor strikes and class conflict? No. You have an archive project on LGBTQ plus activism? No. You have a public history project on Indigenous land dispossession? No. Do you have a history of providing those things? I doubt it. But we need to understand the flip side of this. We've got to cut through the noise here and focus on the action, focus on the facts, and that way we know what the terrain is that we're working on. I used to be a reconnaissance scout. What can I say? What will now get funded? Patriotic education and myth-making. We've got to look through all of the executive orders that are even referenced by incorporation here. They make it explicit what will be funded. Revolutionary War and Founding Father narratives. Expect a flood of projects reinforcing the patriot myth that the Founding Fathers were pure visionaries who fought only for freedom and democracy. If only we had people who worked on that stuff. Military and war memorialization. Battlefield tours, war reenactments, this living history garbage, and projects that portray U.S. military actions as unambiguous victories for freedom, even if those people fighting it were trying to rebel. Projects that present the founding documents as sacred texts. Funding is going to flow towards projects that treat the Declaration of Independence and Constitution as flawless, rather than as contested, evolving, and problematic frameworks. If you've got something that deals with rugged individualism and entrepreneurialism, histories that emphasize personal triumph, again, focus on the individual here, while avoiding discussions of structural barriers. In other words, how federal policies maybe benefited white business owners but excluded black entrepreneurs. Nope, can't do that. If you want to erase or sanitize a slavery narrative as part of your project, then this new NEH is for you. Chattel slavery must be framed as a regrettable but resolved chapter in a triumphant American story. A sideshow at best. All better now. Not a system with lasting economic and social consequences. And they will lean into heritage-style museums and landmarks, holy cabooses. National parks, museums, and public sites will receive NEH funding, even those C3s, only if their programming promotes unity and avoids what they see as controversy, as long as they don't make white people feel challenged or uncomfortable. So the NEH has been reprogrammed into a machine for state-sanctioned nationalism. So what does this mean for public historians? What does this mean for our community? Well, the goal is clear: to erase critical engagement with history and replace it with a sanitized, aggressive, muscular nationalist myth. This is not really about money. It's about who controls history and how that history can be deployed to justify existing power and grabs for more. For those of us who have worked in public history or digital media or documentary filmmaking and museum work, this is a turning point. This is the darkest day in American public history. The war for honest history is no longer a fight for funding. It's no longer a fight for eyeballs. It's now a guerrilla war over the substance of that history, over what the past actually was and what it means in the present, and who we can reach and engage with that in meaningful ways. We are now in the era of resistance historians. So what comes next? Independent funding is the only option, unless you're lucky enough to live in a state that might have some extra dollar bucks held over when they're not fighting for vaccines. If you want to tell real history, you'll need private grants, nonprofit support, or grassroots funding. Maybe, if you're lucky, like I said, your state will have some dollar bucks. But underground public history work is going to expand. Expect more independent digital humanities projects, more self-funded documentaries, and rogue museum programming, a term that I love and that we can talk about a little bit more. Okay, expect more crowdfunding, Substack, Seed and Spark, GoFundMe, and alternative platforms. They are now crucial. If institutions will not support honest history, we're going to have to build our own systems of support. And public historians must organize. We need real alliances of historians, archivists, curators, and storytellers who refuse to comply. The current institutions, the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, the American Association of State and Local History, the National Council on Public History, are not up for this fight. They might send a letter, but that's it. So the future of public history is now a choice. Every museum, historic site, and public history organization now has to choose, and when I say now has to choose, right now, today. And you will see the results of those choices right now, today. Go look. They will either accept the new NEH funding and sanitize history, including their own record in that. They will stay quiet and hope to survive, but in the end, they'll probably end up collaborating or appeasing. Or, less likely, they will resist and fight for the truth, even if it means financial and political risk. I doubt it. But the war for honest history is now an underground fight. So public historians, museum pros, and educators, those folks of you out there on the front line of all this, on the front line of public history, if you're giving a tour on the Salem witch trials, you know who you are. You have to find new ways to tell real history because federal institutions will no longer support it and nonprofits are going to get in line. The next few years will reveal who in this field has the courage to stand for the truth and who's willing to sell it out. But you're not alone. We will stand with you. We will stand for you. And we're going to make the choice every single day to stand for the truth and honest history. Allons-y.